Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to the third Forefront webinar from Dementia Researcher and, of course, the brilliant Alzheimer's Society. I'm Adam Smith. I'm the Programme Director at University College London, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's session for the third time. I think it's somebody else's turn next time. Today we have two wonderful presenters. Firstly, we welcome back Dr. Claire Jonas from Alzheimer's Society, who is going to talk about adapting your writing style for academic audiences. And that session will be recorded and available to watch back on YouTube later on. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to shut up now and ask Claire to turn your camera and microphone on.
Hello.
Hi, Claire. And I'll let you get on with it. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. This is a bit where I always struggle because I'm like, how do I make things share on Zoom? And I'm used to using screens now, but I'm going to do my best. Okay. So fingers crossed, this will show you a PowerPoint slide. All right. So as Adam's just said, I'm Claire Jonas. I'm one of the research communications officers at Alzheimer's Society. Those are my contact details on the screen in case you need me. So today I'm going to talk about writing for different audiences. So as academics, you'll be writing a lot for audiences who are other academics, but you might not get much practice at writing for audiences who aren't familiar with your research. Okay. So there are basically three rules for good research communication. First, you want to know your audience. Second, you need to be clear what you want to achieve. And third, you need to tell a good story. I'm going to mainly talk about the first of these today. If we do another series of these, hopefully I'll be back to talk about the others. One thing I should say is this talk is itself research communication. So here's what I was thinking about when I was making it. Firstly, I knew my audience was going to be largely early career researchers, and I've been an early career researcher myself. So I have a decent level of insight into what that was like, and I can empathize with at least some of your experiences quite easily. Also, this is going to be important later. Given that you work in research, you're probably going to be relatively easily convinced by new evidence. I have two aims in mind. I want to inform you of some of the research on research communication, and I want you to consider adopting or continuing behaviours based on that research. Third, I don't actually know if this is a good story. You can tell me at the end if you want. But the story I'm going to tell you is about how I learned to do research communication. And I'm actually going to tell it in a different order from how I really learned it because I think it makes more sense that way. So let's get on with it. So the very first question is, what is research communication? And I'm going to do that thing where I give you a second to try and come up with your own answer. Feel free to write it in the chat box if you want. Not that I will necessarily be able to see it because of how Zoom works. Okay, hopefully you've had a little time to think about that now. Here's Wikipedia's answer. This is actually their definition of science communication, but replace science with research if that's necessary for your work. And they say it's the practice of informing, educating, raising awareness of science-related topics, and increasing the sense of wonder about scientific discoveries and arguments. It's probably no surprise that it's actually a lot more complicated than this, and I'm going to talk you through some of the reasons it's complicated. There are essentially two types of research communication. There's outreach, which is one way, so the researcher shares their work with others, and that will often happen after you've published a scientific paper about it. That can create some problems. So in dementia research, if you take this approach, you might be asking questions that aren't really that helpful for people affected by dementia, and you'll only find that out when you tell them what you've done. Another issue is that people doing outreach often adopt a deficit model of research communication, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. When I was an academic, most of the communication work I did was outreach. Teaching was a large part of it. That's a very formal kind of outreach. But I also did things like being interviewed for podcasts. I've written an article for The Conversation, that kind of thing. And the one exception to this was working with the artistic collective Bittersweet. So my research was on human multisensory perception, and they create multisensory music performances. Initially, they wanted my input on synesthesia, which was my research specialty, for an interactive musical performance that they were creating. And that started out as outreach, and it turned into a long collaboration. And I still provide science advice to them, but I also act as a pilot tester for their performances, and I do some audience insight work for them as well. Once I started doing science communication full time, I realized I needed to think about science communication as a two-way process, not only saying, here's some science, but also thinking about what others might want out of science. For example, why should someone who's going to donate to Alzheimer's Society care about a new test for dementia? Why should someone in the policy team care about care home design? Why should someone living with dementia care that we've got a breakthrough in the lab when it's never going to make it to them personally? So public engagement is an answer to this in some ways. So for example, this could be a member of the public contacting a researcher with an idea for a research project. The researcher is interested, they design and run an experiment, and during that time they regularly get feedback from that member of the public. At the end, the researcher shares their findings with the member of the public and may also credit them in any scientific publication that they create from it. So much more of a two-way process, much more of a conversation than outreach. These are not the only types of science communication, but they are very common. So I wanted to sort of provide them to you. Okay, so I said this was going to be about writing for different audiences, and I have a question for you. Let's say you want to communicate your most recent piece of research. Who do you want to communicate it to? Who is your audience? So again, I'm going to give you a minute to think about this. All right. If the public was your answer, you are going to need to do some more thinking. And I'm going to talk to you about why. I don't just want to make an unbacked up assertion here. So this is the basic answer. Not everyone likes or cares about research. And this can be a real problem because historically, research communicators have used the deficit model for their work. This is essentially the public doesn't know enough about research. If they knew more about research, they would like it and support it more, and they would make evidence-based decisions. Unfortunately, this isn't true, because if it was true, we wouldn't have anti-vaxxers. Let's talk about why we can't use it. The main reason is the public isn't a monolith. The public isn't a monolith. As an illustration, here's a study done with around 1,000 people. They're just members of the Swiss public, so people from all walks of life. Obviously, be careful about how you generalize it to other audiences, but it is a good example of how different people can have very different attitudes. To create the segments I'm going to talk about in this research, the researchers used interviews to gather information on multiple aspects of how people relate to science, and that includes things like how much they know about science, how much they trust science, whether they actively seek out information about science, how necessary they think science is for society, and also personal characteristics like age and political orientation. All of these factors and more can affect how people will receive communications about research. So they came up with 4 groups. There's the science files, who have high knowledge about science and high trust in science. There's the critically interested, who again have high knowledge but much lower trust. There's the passive supporters, who have some knowledge about science and a high level of trust in it. Oops. And then there's the disengaged segment, so they have low knowledge and low trust. So if you look at this, more than half of the people in this study had an attitude to science which could be summed up either as whatever or go away. And that took me a really long time to realize. And perhaps that's because I largely thought about communicating research in the context of teaching undergraduates. They're really unusual. So they are people who have paid, in the UK at least, to come and learn from me and other psychology lecturers. And even if they weren't enjoying a lecture of mine, they had an incentive to listen because I might ask them about stuff on the exam and they wanted to get a degree. That's the purpose of going to university for a lot of people. The majority of people in the world don't have those incentives, but we still want them to be interested in research. So how do we do it? I'd like to tell you a short story about me and research and my friend Sophie. So just before I start, that Druckmann and McGrath paper at the bottom is not the nonsense article on 5G. It's about communicating climate change science, and it will come into what I say about credibility later. So during the early stages of the pandemic, not that early, a few months in, a friend, Sophie, made a Facebook post linking to a paper that had somehow got into a scientific journal that was saying 5G causes coronavirus. It's since been retracted, just to be clear, and it is clear from a bit of reading that this is likely a journal with some very questionable publication practices. So I want you to take a moment to think about your reaction to someone making that post. Be honest with yourself. If it was someone that you knew, how would you feel? What actions would you want to take? So I'm imagining that probably some people are experiencing anger, frustration, resignation, exasperation, all of those kinds of things. It worked out okay for me. So Sophie is actually a virologist, and her post said, when you think humanity's managed to reach the bottom of stupidity, some people still manage to dig deeper. It's not my area of biology, and I didn't have several hours to spend on understanding what was going on in this paper. So I asked her to explain to me. She did. And I believed her explanation without doing any further investigation of my own, because I know she's a sensible person and that she has a deep understanding of this area of science. Notice there that my reaction to Sophie hinges on two things. I know she is an expert on this topic, and I trust her because she's my friend. So what would have happened if either of those was missing? Would I still have believed her explanation? Don't know. In most of the research communication that I do, my audience doesn't know me, and I can claim I'm presenting information from experts and that they can trust the experts, but why should they believe me? I can provide evidence that what I'm talking about is coming from experts, but that isn't actually going to work because what this hinges on is not how trustworthy the research really is or how trustworthy the person really is. It's about how trustworthy it's perceived to be by my audience. So thinking back to those segments, I can't just drop a ton of peer-reviewed research on passive supporters and disengaged people and have them magically become science files. And that's really irritating, I will admit that. However, there are some things which have helped me sort of deal with the emotions around that. As you're a researcher yourself, I'm assuming everyone listening to this talk is a researcher, you probably know a lot about research and you probably have a high level of trust in the systems that produce research. And you might have some reservations about that. So the ethics of animal testing, for example, or the history of academia as a place that's largely been created by and for wealthy white men. But you probably have a reasonably high level of trust in the area of research that you work in all the same. It's important to remember that that level of trust, and especially that level of knowledge, is highly unusual when you are thinking about research communication. So you might be going, well, why does your level of trust in science and your level of trust in experts matter? And the answer to that is basically people generally don't behave in a very rational way. And stress especially can have pretty strange effects on the brain, as pandemic has shown us. So conspiracy theories flourish at this time. People are less likely to make rational decisions when they're under a lot of stress because difficult emotions, tiredness, memory overload all make it harder to think. And when you're communicating your research, if you're communicating it to people affected by dementia, that is likely to be a source of stress for them. And they may not want to hear what you have to say, especially if it conflicts with what you already believe. Also, I want you to bear in mind that you are an expert on the topic of dementia, and that it's pretty easy for you to tell if a news article or a social media post about dementia is nonsense. But imagine if you were reading a news article about archaeology or astronomy or any other topic that you're not an expert in. It would not be as easy for you to tell apart what was real and what was fake. And this is the position that many people are in when it comes to learning about dementia research. Finally, we can't just go, this is a conspiracy theory, that's fake news. You can't take the Twitter approach to science communication of just going, that's not right, which obviously isn't all that people use Twitter for, but it is a thing I see quite a lot on there. The problem with that is the backfire effect. This doesn't always happen, but quite a lot of the time, if you try and correct misinformation, that can actually cause increased belief in that misinformation. And that's difficult. So all of this is pretty exasperating and saddening, but I do my best to try and deal with this outside of the context of research communication itself. Because to do research communication effectively, you need to empathize with your audience, even if you find that they believe things that you think are ridiculous or horrendous. So the key for me in empathizing with my audience has been figuring out what I want out of communicating research. What am I trying to get someone to do as a result of hearing from me? And how can I match that with what my audience wants? So you can think of it like a jigsaw. You're trying to find a piece of the right shape, the right size, and the right colors to add to a puzzle that's made up of someone's existing knowledge, beliefs, emotions, all of that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, everyone has a different puzzle, so the same piece isn't going to fit into every jigsaw. Luckily, you have a magic jigsaw piece that can change size and shape and color to fit any jigsaw. You just need to know the right magic spell. And I realize I've gone way off into not scientific at all here, but I like the story, so I'm going to go with it. I have a 5-step magic spell that doesn't always work, but works a decent amount of the time when I'm trying to get people to do something as a result of me communicating research to them. So the first question you might want to ask when you're communicating research is not who's my audience, but rather what is my goal? So here are some of the goals that I have when I'm doing research communication. I've framed it as your research in this because I don't really talk about my own research in this way anymore. So I would be communicating your research if we fund you, for example. So you might want to inform people affected by your research. You might want to promote behavior change. You might want to promote policy change. You might want to raise the profile of your research. You might want to educate the next generation of researchers. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the things you might want to do with research communication. Once you have figured out what your goal is, then you figure out who your audience is. And hopefully, now we've given you some more specific examples of goals, you might have a more specific answer as to who your audience is. So I'm just going to go through the aims that were on the previous slide and talk you through different audiences who might be interested in that. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but as we will see, even within a single aim, there are usually multiple audiences. And you're going to need to consider your goal and the specific needs of that audience. And if you have multiple audiences, even if you've got the same goal, you're going to make multiple separate plans. So some example questions, some example audiences for informing people affected by your research. So people living with dementia, family carers, professional carers. Promoting behaviour change in people at risk of developing dementia. Promoting policy change might mean you need to talk to politicians, or it might mean you need to talk to the NHS. If you're raising the profile of your research, you're probably going to be talking to other researchers or funders, or potentially media or social media consumers. So if your research is being featured in the press, for example. And then educating the next generation of researchers, could be children, could be teenagers, could be undergraduate students, could be master's students, could be people who are considering moving into a career in dementia. So there's a lot of different people you could be talking to, even with these quite specific goals. So some of the things you want to think about when you're considering your audience is, what is the level of knowledge that they already have about dementia? Do they even know what dementia is? How much do they care about dementia? Do they think dementia is personally relevant to them? And you can probably see quite quickly that you're going to get very different answers to those questions, depending on whether you're talking to a child or to an MP or to someone who's caring for someone living with dementia. Next, you need to put yourself in your audience's shoes. So here are some examples of things they might need. This is not an exhaustive list. Nothing in this is an exhaustive list. You're probably also going to make some wrong assumptions about your audience. So it's important, if you can, to proactively ask them what they want. You would ideally do that before you do any communication when you're in the planning stage, and after, to see how you can tweak what you did the next time. I'll talk about this a little more in a second. So let's take 5 groups from the previous slide. So what might people living with dementia want? Good quality care is probably a fairly high priority. Emotional support. If they have a familial type of dementia, they might want hope that their children won't have to go through the same thing that they are going through. People at risk of developing dementia probably are likely to want a behaviour change that they can do to be affordable and effective. So it's no good asking people to do something that's expensive and only minimally effective, or even one of those two. You need to try and find ways that you can communicate, this won't be a big change for you, but it will have a small, medium, large effect on your risk of developing dementia. With MPs, they are likely to want a policy change, if you're promoting a policy change that will be popular with the people who vote for them. And again, going to want the policy change to be affordable. Funders, I speak as someone who works at a funder now, so we want high quality research and we want effective research. And we also want the research to help us bring in more money so that we can fund more research in the future. Teenagers, they may or may not know what dementia is. Perhaps if they have a relative or a family friend with dementia, they might know approximately what it is, but they may need some help sort of understanding in more depth. And if they're considering a career in research, they might want to know what support is available to them if they're hoping to go into research themselves. Lastly, you need to think about how you're going to assess whether you've met your goal. Knowing the goal means we know whether we have been successful at the end of it. Unfortunately, some of these are very, very difficult to measure. So again, going back to the original goals, informing people affected by your research, promoting behaviour change, promoting policy change, raising the profile of your research, and educating the next generation of researchers. Once again, just examples of how you might do this. So if you've got a recommendation for a different way to do care, it might be something like the percentage of care homes adopting your recommendations in the area where you've reached out and done your communication. If it's behaviour change, it might be, the proportion of people diagnosed with dementia who have made this change. So is the number of people who've made this behavior change lower than you would expect in terms of the people who are getting dementia? That one was quite a complicated one to think through. Policy change. This one is generally quite simple to know if you've succeeded or not. So has your policy change been adopted or not? That is a massive goal though. So you are probably also going to want smaller changes, smaller measures of whether you're proceeding towards your goal before that big one. Raising the profile of your research. If you're doing this with fellow researchers, perhaps the number of people who want to collaborate with you might be a good measure of that. So how many people do you get contacting you proactively saying, I would like to collaborate with you, your research sounds really interesting. And educating the next generation of researchers. So if you're teaching undergraduates, it might be something like the percentage of your undergrads who go on to become dementia researchers. For all of these, you can also seek out feedback from the people in your audience. So some example questions you might want to ask. What did they think you were trying to achieve when you communicated the research to them? Are they going to do anything differently as a result of what you've told them? Do they feel better equipped to handle a challenge? Did they like how you communicated with them? And importantly, what would they advise you to do similarly or differently next time? So you can then complete the feedback loop. So once you have your feedback, once you have your goal measures, you can use that to inform your next round of research communication. So for me, research communication is often this cyclical process of what's my goal, what's my audience, what does my audience want and need, fitting the storytelling style to the audience, and then assessing how well I communicated, and that feeds into the next round. So the nice thing about research communication is, like everything else, you get better at it the more you practice. So there are a few other things that I haven't talked about here. Everything I've said before is kind of focused on your personal actions. I'm not going to talk about the things that aren't focused on that in loads of detail, but just a prompt to consider them. So you might want to be considering the medium, because there are multiple ways to get a message to an audience. So social media, press releases, blogs, emails, lots of different things. And it's really important to think about which of those your intended audience is most likely to engage with. So if you want to do research communication on TikTok, great, you're going to reach loads of teenagers. Are teenagers your intended audience? So try and find the right platform for what you're doing. There's also the consideration of what effects that has on how you tell your story. So Instagram is really good for highly visual storytelling. Something like a blog, you'll probably be doing much more written storytelling, although you might want a few illustrations of what you're talking about. Just a side note here, if you're interested in using social media for research communication, we've got Dr. Julia Ravi, who is going to be talking about this in more detail in the December Forefront webinar. Secondly, you need to think about your resources. You only have so much time and money available to you for communication work. And you need to think carefully about what is possible for you based on those factors. You might not be able to do everything you want to. You might have to go for a smaller goal. There is one easy way, relatively easy way, to increase your resources, and that is teaming up with others. So your workplace and your funder are both likely to have media teams, social media teams, and perhaps public affairs and policy teams. These are made up of people who specialize in communications to different groups, and they are generally going to be delighted that you want to talk to them about your research. One thing to bear in mind though there is that you won't be the only researcher that they hear from, and they're not automatically going to decide to share your work. They have their own priorities. So that brings us on to working with others. A lot of research communication does involve working collaboratively with other people, and that could be your university's press office, it could be other researchers on the project, it could be people who work for your funder, like me, just to give you an illustration of how many people can be involved in research communication, we quite often do press releases on research at Alzheimer's Society. And when we do one of those, the people who are involved will likely be one or more researchers. So that might not be the researcher themselves, it might be a representation of the researcher, as in, here's a paper that they've published. There are usually 2 people from the research communications team. So we read and digest the science and turn it into everyday language. 2 people from the media team who take what we in the research communications team have said and polish it so that a newspaper or other media outlet will be interested in it. And one of our heads of department or an associate director, because we attribute the comment to them. So they won't have written it, but their name will go on it and they get sign off. Sometimes you also get people from other teams involved. So if it's research that relates to a policy change that we're trying to promote, then the public affairs team might get involved as well. So that's a lot of people, and that can be really difficult because different people have different priorities and goals, and sometimes these compete with each other. So comparing my work with the media team's work, for me, the primary goal is accurately representing the science. And for the media team, that is also one of their goals, but they're also thinking about things like, can we get one of the society's key messages into the statement? So there's overlap, but also conflict in terms of what we're trying to do. We cope with this by triangulating. So the comment will go back and forth in various forms until everyone is more or less satisfied that we've met our goals as best we can. Press comments specifically are normally done under enormous time pressure as well. So this is perhaps one of the most difficult forms of research communication that you might be involved in. However, it does mean that everything else seems a lot easier by comparison. So that's it. I have a list of resources on research communication if you want to learn more, and you're welcome to contact me via my website or on Twitter, or I forgot to put it here, that was silly of me, my email address, which was at the beginning of this talk, claire.jonas@alzheimers.org.uk. Thank you. I'm going to stop my screen share.
Thank you, Claire.
I can remember how.